For this assignment, I chose The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, which was one of the first stories we read in one of our first modules earlier on in the semester. So why I chose this article, although it was relatively short compared to some of the other articles we've read, the first time I read it through, I had a lot of questions at the end and was slightly confused with the ending and how she kind of just left us hanging towards the end of how Louise Mallard died. And I also kind of wanted to see what else was out there and what other viewpoints people had and learn a little bit more about what Chopin was really trying to get across in this story. So some of the controversy in this story, well, I think kind of first and foremost, the story as a whole was quite controversial at the time, as the story kind of opposes the norm of patriarchal society that was of the time and the marriages that were common at the time. Throughout the story, we learn that Louise doesn't grieve like a lot of normal women did back in the day, and the emotions she experiences throughout the story are also different from what was normal at the time. And through Louise Mallard, Chopin was able to provide kind of a sense of what marriage was like at the time. Like I said, it was kind of like they were locked down to this male in their life. And when her husband died, uh, she talked about many of these emotions and feelings that she was able to experience that weren't normal at the time for women, and they weren't ever really able to experience throughout their lives. Another controversial topic is the heart trouble that was mentioned in the first sentence of the story. In today's day and age, we often think of heart trouble. We think of whether it be congestive heart failure, coronary artery disease, hypertension, things more like that, some physical, actual, legitimate health problems. Um, while Luis might have actually had some problem like this heart trouble could be interpreted probably multiple ways. Um, it could be more of an emotional thing, as like you said, she wasn't able to experience a lot of this emotion and stuff, and was probably um, heartbroken throughout the story as she was suppressed by her husband. Another topic that is kind of controversial in the story is her death. It can, like I said, I was kind of confused at the first time I read it and wanted to figure out why and what really killed her, and therefore it can be interpreted in multiple different ways. But Chopin's a story, like I said, for interpretation of the reader by saying that the doctors decided she died of heart disease, of the joy that kills. Not only is it a question of what exactly was killed her, whether it was happiness or heartbreak or whatnot, but there's also some controversy out there as to whether or not she even saw her husband or whether she collapsed and died before she even was able to see him come through that door alive. So the article I chose was Emotions in the Story of an Hour, and this was the summary or kind of the critique of the Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. So some of the main points of the article, again, like I talked about how kind of some controversial things in the story. The author of this article talked a lot about how Chopin was in opposition to paternalism and the current social conventions. And I mean, it's pretty obvious but through reading the story, but this summary also talked a lot about how um, the emotions she experienced and some of the things Louis did throughout the story were very different from the norm. Um, Similar to what we talked about in the modules, actually, was the use of nature. This article also talked a lot about the use of nature in the story. Um, when she went into that room by herself, she actually sat down and was looking out the window and seeing these things in nature and the physical world. And I think seeing those things kind of stimulated her to feel more emotion on the inside that she wasn't able to notice and realize before. She kind of had this new outlook on life. And so I think nature played a big role in stimulating some of these emotions inside of her. But then this article also mentioned how spring especially was important, because you think about spring, it's when plants and animals and stuff like that kind of start a fresh start after a long harsh winter usually, and able to turn over a new leaf. And this was very similar to Louisa's situation and how she was kind of in this long hard drought, hard winter, I guess you could say. And now that her husband passed, she was able to kind of turn over a new leaf and start a new life, and her outlook on life was drastically changed. Louisa's heart trouble, again, was another main point of this article. This summary kind of explained it to be not so much of a physical ailment, but more of like an emotional problem that has been caused by the burden of her husband's powerful will kind of silencing her own, and her not having a say or any right to her own life. And then another thing that this article alluded to a lot throughout was this moment of illumination, which was kind of this time where um, there was all these sudden yet uncontrollable and revitalizing emotions just rushing through um, Louise as she was in that room alone, and it kind of one kind of started another and stimulated another and so on until kind of all just came and hit her at once, and it really just was all leading to her being able to envision her future life free of anyone's say, and her being herself instead of Mrs. Mallard, her being able to be Louise for once. And then this article's take on her death argued that she didn't actually see, or that she did actually see Mr. Mallard come into the door, and that her death was caused by a full body shock of realizing that this newly found freedom that she was able to acquire in that hour alone in the room, and the individuality she would have throughout the rest of her life without having her husband lingering over her, had all been lost once again as soon as he entered that room. And she would have to turn all of her freedom and stuff back over to the patriarchal society and her marriage. And the joy that kills, that is stated at the end of the story. This article said that the joy that Chopin mentions um, is the joy that she refuses to surrender back to her patriarchal husband in return.